With us now is Dr. Saffron Vickers Walkling, who's a senior lecturer in English literature at York St John University. They're also dyslexic, dyspraxic, and has ADHD. Good morning and welcome to BBC Radio York, and thank you so much indeed for agreeing to speak to me on the programme this morning. Nice to meet you.
Good morning. It's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? All of those terms.
It is astonishing, but we've got to get it out there. And wow, dyslexic, dyspraxic, and has ADHD. Can we just talk through some of the characteristics of these conditions? And let's start with the main one, ADHD. How does that manifest itself with you? And how did you suspect that you may have ADHD?
To be honest, no. I mean, I think when we talk about ADHD, we associate it with boys, we associate it with perhaps quite negative characteristics. We might think of young boys or young men really sort of being, caged in a classroom with testosterone and ADHD and all that control, and finding that a very difficult situation. I think that's our classic idea of what ADHD is like. It presents very differently in women who, not always, but tend to be on the inattentive end. So we tend to be maybe a bit ditzy, a bit daydreamy, and that's often associated just with personality rather than being something else. So I think, like many women with ADHD, I was diagnosed really quite late in life. I was in my 50s. I was about 52 or 53 when I was diagnosed.
How did that diagnosis come about? Because, I mean, was it something that you proactively had to go and seek a diagnosis for, to explain things that you were finding difficult in your life? And quite obviously, as a senior lecturer in English literature at a university in York, it's not been something that's held you back.
Absolutely. I mean, I was previously, about 10 years earlier, I was diagnosed with dyslexia, which was a surprise for lots of people because I've got a first-class degree from a Russell Group university. I'd really achieved, but throughout most of my degrees, I was there all the time feeling a bit of imposter. I was thinking, how do people keep on top of everything? How do people manage to read fast? All of those things. And I thought that was just something that was just me failing a little bit, even though it wasn't coming out in my marks, in my essays. Of course, that's one of the things about all of these diagnoses, is that they present very differently in different people. So my end results are often very, very good, but behind that, there's a lot of exhaustion, chaos, panic, a sense of being an imposter. And I think, though, however, because I was teaching at a university, you get a lot of training on this. So you start understanding about these conditions by learning about your students and how to support your students. And then, of course, you're reading this, you go, gosh, that sounds just like me. So, yeah. You go, so it's okay, maybe I should pursue this. But for me, I think,
and obviously,
honest,
can I just interrupt you there? Obviously, you did pursue this then. Did you actually go to somebody and say, look, I know what ADHD is. I've been trained to recognise it perhaps in my students and maybe to modify things in the way I teach them and the way I go about delivering the information to them. But I can see that stuff in me. Could you research me and find out whether I could be diagnosed as a person who has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder?
Absolutely, yes. So I'd already had a dyslexia and dyspraxia diagnosis, which are done by educational psychologists, usually through an educational institution. So that diagnosis was already in place. And I had that diagnosis actually after quite long period of sick leave, because I went through a sort of a period of mental exhaustion, because people with things like ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, we try to pretend that we're neurotypical people, because we don't know that we're not quite often. But when I was getting that support, I was doing my PhD at the University of York. I'm working at York St John. I had a lot of neurodivergence support coming in from experts, and I had two different experts who were supporting me with my dyslexia and dyspraxia, and they both said to me, I think you should also look at attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And as soon as they said that, because I've been doing some research on it myself, that made sense. ADHD and autism is diagnosed slightly differently from dyslexia and dyspraxia, so it's medicalized. So you have to go through your doctor. So I approached my doctor. I decided that I wasn't going to try to be like a super A-grade student and tell them how I was on my best of days, but tell them how I was on my worst of days.
Right.
And think about how I was when my strategies weren't working. And I went forward for diagnosis from there, yes.
How were you on your worst of days before you knew that this was your diagnosis? Can you say something that maybe somebody listening to the programme might be able to identify with and go, oh yeah, that's me?
Yeah, I will give an example. So my colleague at work, a lovely, lovely colleague at work, who I'm very chatty with, I think used to sometimes walk into a shared office. I now have my own office, but would think, oh my goodness, we've been burgled. Oh no, it's Saffron's desk. So if you imagine a really, really messy desk, I'm sitting at an unbelievably messy desk at the moment, chaos all around me, some pretty things, some books, but basically chaos. That is what being ADHD feels a bit like. There's always too much. You can't quite find the thing that you're looking for because you've got to get through all these other things first. So I sometimes think that my physical space, which can get very messy, very chaotic, can reflect like what my mental space is like. There's almost too much going on. Another example I was thinking of that I think really sums up the positives of that as well, because if you're now thinking like, oh, it's just a messy space, that's a really bad thing. I sometimes think that my ADHD mind is a little bit like a firework display. So I have all these amazing ideas all the time, sparkling up the sky, and it's wonderful. But when I go out to reach them, sometimes they just disappear just that moment before I manage to capture them. And also around all that beautiful light and sparkle of these wonderful ideas, there's a lot of black space where I think it's your neural pathways can't quite make connections between things. So that makes life for people with neurodivergence very, very exhausting, because you're constantly having to force yourself to make connections. You're constantly having to capture ideas before they disappear. So you're sort of working twice as hard as neurotypical people just to do very, very simple things, just to grab onto the basics.
Do you know, so much of what you've said in the last few minutes I can identify with, and I'm beginning to wonder whether I ought to be investigated for ADHD. Because I've just always put it down. I've always just put it down to me being a bit hopeless. Is there something you can do?
That being a bit hopeless is so common. I think most people with ADHD who've had late diagnosis, they would say that. Yeah, right, they would go like, oh, we just feel hopeless. We feel like failures. Yeah.
What help is available once that diagnosis has been made? Or is it just helpful to get the diagnosis that gives you an explanation as to why you are the way you are?
I think for me, obviously, the diagnosis is incredibly helpful because it just makes you understand things. And I think now that the shame associated with neurodivergence is being lifted, I think it's really helpful to get that diagnosis. Then what's quite difficult, though, is getting support in place. So if once you get the diagnosis, you're offered medication. Medication works for some people and not for others. I take a very low dosage of medication, and that's been really, really brilliant for me. It just gives me, I think people talk about having, I don't know if you know the teaspoon theory, that everybody has so many teaspoons of energy per day, and that people with chronic ill health or with neurodivergence have less teaspoons. Well, what the medication does for me is it gives me enough teaspoons throughout the day so that I've still got a teaspoon at the end of the day, just as I would at the beginning of the day. But what was really, really helpful for me has been getting neurodivergence coaching and getting actual workplace support. And those don't come automatically. You have to seek those out. If you're a student, you get through that through the disabled student allowance. So many young people are diagnosed rather at university. And if you're an adult in the workplace, you have to go that through the Department of Work and Pensions through something called Access to Work, which is very long and very bureaucratic, but it is worth it. And then if you get that support in place, that is literally, I'd say it's life-changing. My life in the last 2 years has been transformed in really, really positive ways because of this diagnosis and because of the support that I've been able to get around that diagnosis.
Do you know, I have the sensation this morning that I'm speaking to a happy, content person who understands herself an awful lot better. We're so grateful to you for being so honest and for speaking so beautifully and eloquently about this morning. I think there'll be all sorts of people who are listening in that will have identified with things you've said and will have found what you said this morning extremely helpful. Thank you so much indeed for giving us your time this morning. Nice to speak to you.
Thank you very much.
Good to have you on BBC Radio. That's Dr. Saffron Vickers Walkling, and they are a senior lecturer in English literature at York St John University. So there we are. There's the experience of someone who has not just ADHD, but also dyslexia, dyspraxia. Is all this ringing true with you? Are you listening to what our guest has just said and thinking, hang on a minute, that's me? Or maybe you too have been through this whole process of identifying something about your life, or maybe the way that one of your kids is reacting to things in the world, maybe a little bit differently to other people, and gone ahead and got a diagnosis. What difference has it made? How much of a struggle is it to get the diagnosis? Please share your story, as the good doctor has just shared their story with us this morning. The number to call, 0800 111 48 49, or you can send me a text. It's 81333. Start the message with the word York.